So Anne gets to meet Diana, and Diana was mentioned earlier on, and they talked, or Marilla talked about how she had a heathenish name, and because the teacher who came to the island and all sorts of Roman and Greek mythology. So Diana is the name of a Greek goddess. More mythology, Dryads are river spirits. So you have these different spirits in the pagan lore that deal with different elements and places. And Dryads are water, Nereids are the ocean. Uh, Dryads, Nereids, there's a bunch of others. And it's like they each have a different thing. So some are the woods, some are the river, some are the ocean, some are. And they all have, there are these spirits that resemble people that inhabit the area. Um, Anne was a chatterbox. She's just blah, 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 going through a million different things. And that's okay. That's okay. I mean, some people like to talk, some people don't like to talk. That's why she gets along perfectly with Matthew, because he's just like, doesn't have anything to say, and she needs to say everything. So, it's like, yeah, it's balance. Talked about the paths in the garden and shells lining the path. So it's fairly common in seaside places to decorate with shells. And the effect looks really nice on a place with Prince Edward Island, where there's a stark contrast between the color of the ground and the color of the shell. As I said before, Prince Edward Island, it's all this red sandstone. And so when you put the shells down on top of the red sandstone, it looks cool. Um, there are towns where back in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, that were paved with oyster shells. Seaside communities up and down the Chesapeake Bay, up and down the James River, where you had these massive oyster beds. When people would go through, they would haul up the oysters from the bottom of the sea, or from the bottom of the bay, from the bottom of the river, and put them on the boat and go back. And they shuck the oysters, take the meat out, and what do you do with the shell? You just dump it. And this is good for lining the roads because they break down. It's a relatively soft rock. Oyster shells is like limestone, so it's relatively soft. But it's bad for the oysters, because the way oysters work is they release their little babies, little baby oysters, sprat they're called. They release the eggs and the fertilizing, and you have the baby oysters who are just sort of floating, and they float around for a little bit until they stick to something. But the thing is that they can only stick to something hard. So they can stick to a rock, they can stick to metal, they can stick to other oyster shells. But if you pull up all the oyster shells and you're left with a sandy or muddy bottom, the oysters can't stick to it. So what they've taken to doing in places is sinking blocks of concrete. So you sink a block of concrete, and the oysters cling to the concrete, and they start growing out. And then, you have oysters growing out around the edges, and on top, of course, but growing out around the edges, and then others can grow out around the edges there and around the edges there. So it just sort of grows out like a mushroom. So that's one of the things that they're doing. Sunken ships. Sometimes ships are sunk intentionally to make coral reefs, and coral works the same way that the oysters do. They're little animals that stick to things. Oysters and coral aren't really related. Coral is Cnidaria. They're closer to jellyfish, believe it or not. So the squishiest living thing on the planet is actually closely related to the hardest living thing on the planet. Well, not quite the hardest. There's like a snail that incorporates iron into its shell. But that's an oddity. generally the hardest things are going to be things like oysters and oh, yeah, I guess snails are related to oysters, aren't they? They're both mollusks. Never mind. Yeah, hardest thing in the world are mollusks. The softest thing in the world. Oh, no, coral. Sorry. Yeah, coral is hard, and yeah, so those two aren't related, but coral isn't really related to mollusks. But coral is pretty much solid rock. I mean, if you find a piece of it, it looks like a very ornate rock because you have all of these little, all of these tiny, tiny, tiny little cells. It's a little tiny animal. I mean, it's like a millimeter across, 16th of an inch, and you have them clustering together, and all of them have these little hard shells, and they send these little tentacles out and pull in little bits of food and eat them, just like a jellyfish does, except the jellyfish floats and pulls it up in while the coral are stuck to the ground and pulling down. But same thing. Really, it is the same thing. And they talked about the plants and all of the different flowers. And I have tiger lilies growing outside. Very pretty. They're also called daylilies because they bloom for one day, but they spread like wildfire. And because they spread like wildfire, they're all over ditches because once one takes hold, they send out roots, they drop seeds, but they're pretty. So, I let them live. There's also bleeding hearts were mentioned, and I have some bleeding hearts. And those spread a little bit. But I've corralled them. They were just spreading and spreading and spreading. It's like, okay, yeah, this is as far as you go. You get to live here. And so they're living there. But I have one section that's maybe 12 feet across, 12 by 12. And it is just wildflowers. I raked up the grass, raked up the earth, and I got wildflower seed. So it's indigenous wildflowers, and I just sprinkled it. And so it has the effect of much like they described in the garden, that when the flowers are blooming, it's just this riot of color. And it makes my heart happy. It makes me happy to just see the flowers bloom like that. So